this is an opportunity for us to remake the way that journalism works and to have it actually serve also as a community connector. And in that way, I think there's a tradition, and you know this well, from smaller weeklies that have been around for, hundreds of years. That's a lot of what their focus has been. Most people don't think about them, though. They think about sort of larger media. I've worked in some of those environments. Some of them had, there were staff, obviously, who had that at their core, what they wanted to do. That wasn't necessarily what the business was there to do. And so I think this is a real great opportunity to help reimagine and remake what journalism could look like now and what it can look like in the future, which is super exciting.
Welcome to the Local News Matters podcast, where we explore pathways to stronger journalism, better businesses, and healthier communities. I'm Tim Regan-Porter, CEO of the Colorado Press Association. This episode, I talk with Amy Kovac-Ashley, the Executive Director of Tiny News Collective. Amy shares how Tiny News Collective supports early-stage news founders in addressing the specific needs of their communities, providing resources and tools, especially for those traditionally excluded from the industry. We discuss both the successes and the challenges of local news startups. She emphasizes the importance of diverse voices and tailoring your editorial focus and your business to local needs. Previously, Amy was the head of national programs at the Lindfest Institute for Journalism and the executive vice president and chief of news transformation at the American Press Institute. She has experience in hyperlocal and national news as a reporter and editor, and served as associate dean at Georgetown University's Masters of Professional Studies program in journalism. Amy holds an MS in journalism from Columbia University and an MA in Russian and Eastern European Studies from Stanford University. If you like this episode and what we're doing more generally, please follow in your favorite podcast app, leave us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts, and tell your friends about us. This is a side project and a labor of love, and your support means a lot. You can find past episodes, full transcripts, and relevant links, and sign up for our newsletter at localnewsmatterspodcast.com, or for lazy typists like me at lnmpod.com. You can also follow us on most social media channels at lnmpod. And now I bring you Amy Kovac-Ashley. All right, welcome, Amy. Thanks for being on the podcast.
Thanks for having me, Tim. I appreciate being here.
So you took the job as executive director of Tiny News how long ago now?
I started in January of 2024.
So what attracted you to the position?
So I am really drawn in by our mission and the idea that, we really need to be thinking about what the landscape of local news looks like, and that there's a real opportunity right now to support the early stage news founders out there across the country who are trying to serve their communities from the ground up. It's really important that, as the media is changing and as the landscape changes, that people are still being served, and more importantly, that they're being served in the ways that they need to be served. And I think that's a really great opportunity for early stage founders and for our members in particular to really think about what are the audience needs that are happening in their communities and how can they meet those needs. We also, a big part of our mission is to make sure that we're providing the resources and community and tools to folks who might have found that challenging to do in the past because those avenues were not really open to them, or if they were open, they may not have been the most welcoming. And, as you well know, there's sort of the concept of news deserts that we've all been talking about for a long time, of folks that are kind of like losing their news. But there's been lots of communities across the country who have never been very well served. And I would argue that those folks have been in their own version of a news desert for many, many years. We just have not really paid close attention to that. And so that's another area that we really want to be serving and supporting folks who are raising their hands to sort of be that community news and information provider and a community connector. I think that's a really important piece to all of this as well, is that this is an opportunity for us to remake the way that journalism works and to have it actually serve also as a community connector. And in that way, I think there's a tradition, and you know this well, from smaller weeklies that have been around for, hundreds of years. That's a lot of what their focus has been. I think most people don't think about them, though. They think about sort of larger media, or even metropolitan dailies, those sorts of things. And I don't know, I've worked in some of those environments. Some of them had, there were staff obviously who had that at their core, what they wanted to do. But that wasn't necessarily what the business was there to do often. And so I think this is a real great opportunity to help reimagine and remake what journalism could look like now and what it can look like in the future, which is super exciting.
And so a lot of what you're getting at is kind of summed up on the Tiny News website with the big headline. You can change what local news looks like. We can help. So I want to dig into both pieces of that, which you've alluded to, both of those, but I want to dig into the details. So first, let's start with going a little more in depth and changing what local news looks like. So you've talked about some of that, but what is the scope of that in your mind that Tiny News is there to help with?
So there's a couple of different factors, I would say, right? I think there's the first thing that I think of is who is a publisher, right? Who can be a publisher? I think that when you look at our members, you look at those folks and you may, if you have more of a traditional point of view, maybe like, that doesn't look like a publisher to me, right? It doesn't look like the person 20 years ago or even 10 years ago, or even now in a lot of the larger places. We have a lot of folks that don't look like the people who have traditionally been called publisher. So, we have a lot of members. The majority of our members are women and women of color, and there's a large percentage of our members who are also LGBTQ. So there's like a lot of folks who've been, not really welcomed into the industry in the last however long. And so we just want to be able to just like literally we're changing the face of what a publisher looks like, right? And I think connected to that also is that a publisher is not somebody who necessarily has to come up through traditional journalism, right? I will just disclose that I did go to journalism school. I do have a master's in journalism. I'm happy to talk to anybody about that at some other time about why I did that. People make that choice for very specific reasons, but not everybody wants to do that, nor is that necessary. And I think, a lot of our members are also people who are community members who are in the place that they're trying to serve. And that's how they kind of caught this bug, not necessarily through sort of more of a professionalized sort of journalism kind of a way. They've come up through the community end and they see providing news and information as part of their mission. And I think we need to sort of widen the scope to make sure that we're including those folks as well. The other thing that I would say is when we think about how things can look different is, we talk a lot about wanting to have innovative business models and do things differently. And we don't still see, like the word innovation is a really interesting one because it like the hardcore innovation, I'm not sure that we're totally seeing that, but I think there's opportunities for us to really see that on the smaller scale because people know their communities really well. So just an example of that. And it's a very nascent example, but one of our members, Kara Coleman, who has a site called Future Tides, and she covers the Puget Sound area specifically about the waterways. So the people who live on the waterways, who work on the waterways, who play on the waterways, right? She herself, I think, lived on the water for a long time. And she recently just decided that she was going to be doing some tours as part of the work that she does. So she has a website, she's producing content, all of those sorts of things. But there's an opportunity for her to really do more audience engagement. And, there's an interesting piece of this, trying to show things to people. When you're in a local place, you can do that, right? Like the Washington Post isn't necessarily going to do that because their reach is national and global. But for places that are really local, we got to think about other revenue opportunities and other sort of ways to get people into the funnel. It's possible someone would come on one of her tours and never have seen her site, just they saw her somehow in social media or wherever else. It's also possible they would come to the site and go to a tour. So I think there's a really cool experimentation that she's doing to try to figure out how does she both provide more information and connection around the content area that she's focused on, and can that be a revenue driver for her? Can that be one of many different options, right? I think we've all gotten away from the idea that there's going to be one silver bullet to the revenue pie here. I'm going to mix all my metaphors. But that, that idea of a tour is we could say that's sort of an offshoot of like the concept around events, for example, right? But it's very specific to what she's trying to do. And I think that's something that gets at sort of us being in a position to help people who are really remaking journalism. I wouldn't have come up with that idea. I will tell you that right now, right? But that's an amazing idea, and she's trying to serve her community through that. And I think there's other opportunities like that for folks who are really thinking about this in a little bit of a different way, and who are also very specifically trying to reach certain folks. And she's got a very clear definition of who she's trying to serve. I will say that I loved a recent story of hers that it was all about the orcas, because I'm just interested in orcas. I don't live in Puget Sound area. So it's not that other people might not be interested in it. It's just that she knows who her audience is and who she wants to serve. And I think that's very true for a lot of our members. We have a number of sites, and this is something I want to dig into more when I have a little bit of time, but we have a number of sites who are covering arts and culture in wherever they are. There's a couple sites there's one site in particular that is covering it more across the country, but there's a few sites of ours that are looking at specific areas, and then they're looking at arts and culture in those communities. And I find that really fascinating. I sort of have a little bit of a hypothesis that that's because so many local newspapers had divested from that kind of content pretty early on. But what I think is so interesting about kind of getting back into that space is arts and culture is a place where you can bring people together. And I think we really need those spaces of bringing people together because, as we know, the country is very polarized and divided in a lot of ways. And so we need to be looking for those bright spots of things where we bring people together. So that's why Austin Vita, which is Nancy Flores in Austin, she is covering arts and culture, but specifically for the Latinx population in Austin, which is huge. Like both of those things brought together is huge. There's a pretty large opportunity for her from an audience perspective, right? And then in Wichita, we have a site that just launched just in April through a partnership with the Wichita Foundation called The Shout, and they are covering arts and culture in Wichita. And the first thing they launched with was a community calendar. And, it had something like 250 events for the month of April that they had just scoured from everywhere that they included. And it was the very first thing they launched with. And I think that's important because it's a service to people. And then since then, they've been doing a lot of really cool feature content. They had a really awesome, I think it's called like Record Day, where, you can go to your like local record store, and they had this whole thing, and somebody had written about leafing or filing through all the crates, which is something that folks who go to record stores do. Like that's part of the experience, right? And so they had these lovely photos from the event and all these things. And it took this thing that was like, yeah, National Record Day, but it brought it home into their community and went to local stores and talked to local people about what that meant to them. And so I think it's those kinds of things that we have a real cool opportunity to help sort of sprout and flower that may not be what folks think of when they first think of local journalism.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, as you said, I think you're seeing more of that come back because I think people are realizing how important it is. I mean, investigative journalism, is a big part of why we're the Fourth Estate, right? That's one of our unique roles to play. But it's not all of life, and it's not all of what people want out of their local communities and their local news. And so it has value in and of itself. People want to know what's going on. It has value to connect the community. And it also has value for audience because, investigative journalism needs a platform to, for people to read it. And, if you're just doing investigative journalism, first of all, hopefully your community's not so corrupt that at a local level you've got daily investigative stories, right? So you need all of this to really, I think, thrive as a local news ecosystem.
Well, and the other thing is the interesting thing about The Shout, and I don't know that they've done this just yet. They really literally just launched a month ago. But I know they've got it in their plans to think about accountability journalism as part of the overall picture as well, right? So a lot of maybe not a lot of public money, but there's public money that goes into the arts, right? And where does that money go? Who's getting that money? Is it the same people every year? Is it being equitably distributed? Like those questions are out there. And I think they are setting themselves up for being able to do some of that work in addition to the other things that they're doing, and to have a nice mix of different types of content. So I think there's a way to weave those things together, particularly around specific topics, because if you're an expert in a topic, you'll be able to kind of, level it up and down however you want to provide that information to people. So I'm really excited to see what they're able to do in that space once they've kind of got their feet under them a little bit more. But they've been doing a really amazing job, and we're really lucky to be able to work with them. And they've brought a lot to the community. We just had a collective call. So one of the things that we do with our members is we have these 3 different synchronous calls with them once a month. One of them is just a collective call that everyone can join. We encourage our board members to come if they're able to, because many of them have had startup experience as well. And it's just an opportunity to sort of share what's going on with us from an organization standpoint, and then also have members share what they're up to. And so it's lovely to be able to see them and hear about what's going on. Yeah, it's just been really great to see from the pre-launch phase to now how things are going, and where the pain points are, right? Like what have they learned in the last month or so? What are they wanting to do differently? I think you can, when you're starting up, you can really ask those questions, and you're not wedded to anything in a way that I think, at least in my experience in traditional kind of legacy media, trying to stop doing something was always a challenge, because so many people kind of saw it as sort of a sacred cow often, to be able to adjust, or even just to reflect, like, how's this going, right?
Absolutely. So let's talk a little bit about how you help. And I'm particularly interested in this, not only for understanding how you work with your newsrooms, but as someone who is at a press association and works with lots of journalism support organizations. And of course, you worked at American Press Institute and LinFest. I think there is growing realization that the support functions are really crucial, because we have so many, not just these startups, but, family-owned newspapers, all the way up to some of the more the independent chains, where we have a lot of duplication of effort. There's no reason that a 3-person family-owned newspaper should be doing everything from the tech stack to the billing and collections to the reporting to the selling. And so I think I'm very interested in digging into your approach and what you provide your members and how others might learn from that.
I am in violent agreement about too much duplication. And I think that's why, that's another reason that I was attracted to come here, is that we've really chosen a lane. And I like to talk in t-shirt sizes. So we really are working with the extra, extra small, and a little bit of small. And then we are super happy to, when people outgrow our resources, we're super happy to help them graduate into wherever they want to go, whether it's Lion or INN or any number of other sorts of associations that are out there that are really there to support journalism. And so for us, we have a number of different ways that we support our members. One is with the community. And so that's sort of our basis, and our foundation is really bringing together the community, these synchronous calls and engagements that we have around workshops and things like that to bring people together. We actually have 2 tiers of membership, because we know that not everybody's going to need everything all at the same time. So our community tier is really around our Slack community, these collective calls. We also have a founders only call. We don't go to those. We just open up the room for founders to talk to each other. It's not recorded. It's meant to be a safe space for folks to talk to each other about what's really going on and all of that. And then the third one that we do every month is some kind of workshop, and that will toggle all over the place, quite honestly. So we just recently did one on audience surveys, and earlier this year we had 2 founders who are farther down the spectrum. So we had Mazen Sadahmed from Documented and Jaquanda from Flint Beat come join us. And that was really fascinating. They were talking about the things that they learned, the things they wish they'd done differently. It was a packed house. There was a lot of nodding on that call, because it was just I think they felt seen by that. And it was really great to be able to hear from folks who've been, pretty successful, but also are still trying to figure things out, right? I mean, I think that's one of the things that is different now is that we're all still trying to figure things out. The idea of what success, and we always ask this question of what does success look like? It can really change over time, right? And I think the other part for us that's important, which I should have said earlier, is that growing, and the word scale always scares me because I don't know what people mean when they say that. Like, in what universe can we scale, right? Local doesn't exactly scale. Like, let's just be honest about that, right? But I think for us, it's a really important thing to think about what's the appropriate amount of growth and how do you get there, right? And so those are the kinds of things that we talk about with people. So we do things on the editorial side of the house. We do things on the more business side of the house. We're going to have a session coming up about sort of building up your membership, those sorts of things. And then also the personal, which is where that particular workshop that I was just talking about sort of falls into that. Like, we want to recognize these are human beings who are going through this, and it can be very isolating to be somebody who started something up, especially if you're doing it by yourself at the beginning, if you're a solopreneur. Some of our folks are co-founders, which is great because they have another person, but most of them aren't. So those are the basics of the sort of the community tier. And then in addition to that, in our publisher tier, we offer a number of other different things. So we have access to some legal help, both from the business side, but also editorial help. We also offer a tech stack to folks. We use a particular theme. It's the Tiny News theme on Ghost. And we will help get people set up on that and provide technical expertise on that. We do have some members who aren't using our tech stack, and that's cool. Like, that's, people need to use the things that they need. And we don't want to be prescriptive about that, but we do offer Ghost as an opportunity for folks who want something to get started with. I've actually been pretty impressed by the platform, quite honestly. I've had some conversations with the folks over there, and their approach is very much in line with ours from a mission standpoint, I would say, especially for very, very small publishers who don't have a lot of money when they start out, right? And so it gives them a platform to have both a website and a newsletter. We could talk until we're blue in the face about how important newsletters are. And I think that's really important for people starting up as well, to get those email lists so they have that direct relationship with their community. So the tech stack, the access to legal help, and then we offer a number of additional consulting hours with the folks who are in our publishing tier. So the way that's kind of been working lately, although I will say there are likely changes coming because I'm in the process of hiring a new membership director, our very first. So more to come on that in the next couple of weeks, hopefully. I'm very excited about bringing somebody onto the team and, having somebody come in and really look at what we're doing and think about what other member services we can provide and how are the things that we're doing now, how's that working. But one of the recent situations is we had that workshop on audience surveys. And so to our publishing tier members, we're offering some consulting hours with the person who did that workshop for us. So they will have one-on-one time with somebody to talk about their own situation, about whichever surveys they want to do, or if they've already done one, they could talk about sort of how they analyze the data, those sorts of things. So we really want to give access to as many of the folks who come into us and others as well, so that they're getting as much help as they need as they're figuring things out. One thing I would just want to underscore broadly is these businesses, whether they will remain for-profits or become nonprofits, these are their businesses, right? We're there to help, in service of them, but it's important for them to be making the decisions that work for them and their communities and their, what they need to see in front of them. So we are not overly prescriptive about a lot of things. We want to provide options of things to look at. Our Slack community is pretty active. We're posting opportunities and things there all the time. We've been, as you can imagine, very active on talking about this press forward open call that's we're sort of in the middle of at this point in time, because our members are eligible for that, right? Not all of them, but a large number of them are eligible. And, we want to give them as much information about that possibility because operating funds are so hard to come by. And, what Press Forward is offering, I think, is a really, I was heartened to see that they were starting with small news organizations, because that's exactly we're tiny, right? That's exactly who we serve. And so I'm hopeful that a lot of these folks will apply, and we want to make sure that we're getting them the information and as much as we can, and supporting them as well. One other thing I didn't mention, because I don't know why I didn't mention it, but both for our community tier and for our publishing tier, we offer fiscal sponsorship at a really reduced rate. And that's incredibly important for these startups who they might know they want to be a nonprofit, but they don't have their designation. They want to be able to have a way to take in, all different levels of donations from folks. And so we can serve as their fiscal sponsor in both the community and the publishing tier. We also do that on the side for clients as well. And we will be we're in the process of sort of putting together more materials and being a little bit louder, I would say, and clearer about that service that we're going to offer. But we have been offering it to people sort of quietly here and there, and we'll be doing more of that in the coming months. There's another hire I'm going to be making that will sort of help us kind of systematize that a little bit better as well. But the fiscal sponsorship is not, it's definitely something that people need, and we are set up in order to be able to do that.
And how many members do you have?
So I think we're above 30 founders at this time. There's a couple so that doesn't exactly equate to sites, because there's a couple co-founders, and there's a few that are founders, but they don't have a site yet because they haven't launched yet. So one of our other Wichita partners is going to be launching in June. So we're trying to help her get ready for that. So it's a funny thing, because on our website, and we were just talking about this the other day, on the website right now, at least, the way that we're listing our members is through their logos. But if you're an organization that doesn't have a logo yet, we're not really displaying you. So we need to think about that, because we're working with startup organizations who may not have a logo yet. So we need to think a little bit more about that.
And how long's the collective been around?
So that's a great question, too. So we've been around for about 4 years, come this fall, I believe. But as you can recall, 4 years ago was 2020. And so I think, there was a lot going on with how we got started. We were sort of birthed by something called News Catalyst, which was sort of the brainchild of Aaron Pillhofer, who was then at Temple University. And there were two other folks, Heather Bryant and Tyler Fisher, who are the co-founders of Tiny News. And the three of them were initially working for News Catalyst. So they didn't sort of switch into having kind of full-time staff just for Tiny News until a little bit later in the process. We did start out a little bit differently than what we're doing now. Not in concept, but in the way we were doing it. We had started out more with cohorts coming in. So we had 2 cohorts come in all at the same time, a group of people. We had done like a big national call and all of that. We've sort of moved away from that. I think I've worked on a lot of cohorts, as I know you have as well. Cohorts work best when people are coming in somewhere around the same like timing and all those sorts of things. And that wasn't necessarily true for what we were doing. I think the other part of it is we were originally, and I'm a little fuzzy on some of the details because I wasn't around for this, but I think we were originally thinking of what we were doing more as an accelerator of sorts. Like, we're going to do this for this defined period of time, and then you're going to fly off into the sunset. But what we realized is that people still need help. Like they just because we say that this is going to be 5 months long or 6 months long doesn't mean that all of a sudden their site is going to start just running away with each other, right? Like at that point. So I think, we've been learning from that cohort experience. Since then, we've been doing partnerships with places like Wichita Foundation and the New Mexico Local News Fund. That's been kind of a variation on a cohort, I would say. But because we're not kind of taking them through a curriculum all at the same time, I think it's allowed for a little bit more flexibility. And, even with the Wichita folks, there were 3 sites that came out of that. One of them, Claudia Amaro, has a site called Planeta Venus, and she's been up and running for a while. Like, she's not at the stage of the Shout folks, because the Shout just launched in April. She's had a site up for a long time. So they're in very different areas, they can help each other and they talk to each other. And it's really cool to see that group of people really, really helping each other and connecting with each other, because they can meet in person, which is great. But, bringing them in as a cohort wouldn't make a lot of sense. Claudia's like, I already got this stuff. Like, I don't need this. I need something else. So we need to be able to kind of meet people where they are. I do think that we'll, once this new membership director comes on, I do want to go a little bit more in a deep dive of like how, what are the different pathways in, there's some opportunities, I think, for us to partner with other folks like Wichita and New Mexico, as well as other journalism support organizations like the Documenters program, for example, or the Journalism and Design program at the New School has this really great community college sort of credit or non-credit program that they've been doing. So there's lots of folks in the industry that we want to sort of be partnering with and making sure that folks know that we exist and what we're here for. I think, because we just haven't been around as long. And so, part of what I've been thinking about a lot is around how do we get in the right spaces for folks to see, what we're doing and to make the connection with us, and how that's different than maybe what some other folks who are journalism support organizations are doing in the industry and in the field. And then also, how can we better work together to create those bridges for our members when they're ready to fly the coop, and how can we support them into their next phase, even if that's not with us.
You mentioned earlier how important the community aspect of what you provide is. What else have you seen? What are your members' biggest struggles, and where have you been able to be instrumental in helping them?
Wow. Okay. So there's a lot of different things, I think. And it also depends on what stage you're at, right? So people will ask questions about like different tech integrations or different things they should be doing to set up various parts of the business, right? There's like the nuts and bolts kinds of things around budgeting, for example. That's a pain point that we've seen for folks, is around budgeting and accounting. And so we've tried to bring in some resources around training and workshops with regard to that. What would be great is if there was like the equivalent of, sort of like accountants for reporters kind of idea, right? I was having a conversation with somebody about that the other day, and they were like, yeah, we've been trying to think about that too, but, they're just like, accountants don't need jobs. Like, everybody needs accountants. So how do we like attract the right group of people to sort of help these smaller news organizations? So that's a conundrum, I think, of sorts. I think the other part of it is there's the personal element of things. I mentioned that a little bit before, but it's sort of like, when you're a solopreneur and you have a death in the family, what do you do, right? How do you communicate that about that to your audience, that you're not going to, maybe they depend on something that you're doing every Monday or whatever. And how do you communicate with people about that? Do you communicate with people about that, right? These are very personal things that these folks are doing in their work life, but they also are having regular lives, right? And so I think what I've been really heartened by is that when folks share that information with us in our community, there's like a wellspring of support for one another, both on those things, but also on the wins, right? We have a channel in our Slack that's just called Amplify. And I'm constantly like berating people, like, tell us what's going on so we can tell other people. But it's so cool to see like when, one of our members is featured as a speaker somewhere, or, they did something really cool with their content that's a little different than others. So there's a site that we have as a member called Project Optimist in Minnesota. And she's been doing this really interesting series on wildfires in Minnesota. And as part of that, she's been working with a comics journalist, right? So like really cool, interesting things. And we want people to know that, right? We want to highlight what they're doing. There was a meeting, like a conference last week called the Newsletter Conference. I think it was the first time they had done it. It was in New York. And 3 of our members went. They were there. They got some support from the Knight Foundation to go, which is really great. Shout out to Duck Lou for recognizing them and getting them to go. And it would I was like, send me a picture of all 3 of you together. And so we want to celebrate both the wins, but also really support each other through, some of the things that are hard about this. And I think that the perennial topic, and we can't get away from it, is just funding and revenue options for folks, right? That's the sticking point for a lot of folks, and we want to think about ways to help them with that. That's, again, why I'm so excited about this Press Forward opportunity. That's a pain point, I think, for the industry overall. Our folks see it in a very stark way because they are starting their own things, and, their own bank accounts, their personal bank accounts are also affected by whether they can bring money in or not. And with so many founders, I know a lot of founders of organizations that have been around for a while, they didn't start paying themselves until like year 3 or 4. And even then, it might have been half of what was market rate, right? And so we're being really real with folks about that's what has generally been happening in a lot of places. There's the outliers, of course, of the larger startups like the Houston Landing and other things like that. But I do think those are outliers. And there are many more people out there who are starting their own things and don't have access to millions of dollars to start with. And the thing that I beat the drum over is let's remember that those people are part of the ecosystem, and we can't forget about them. And we actually need to support and fund them. Because we really need to, we need to see which of those seeds are really going to be able to flower. And the only way to do that is to give them some support to do that.
Yeah. And for the members you're working with, what is the revenue sources, for your members? Is it reader revenue, advertising, philanthropy, tours?
It's all of the above. And again, this is where it gets into, I can't say overall our members are doing this thing, because they're all sort of making their own choices about that. Let me back up and say, I would say we're sort of we have 3 buckets of members, right? We have ones who come to us knowing they want to be a nonprofit, but they start out with an LLC or whatever they need to do in order to get set up, and will get their nonprofit designation when they are able to do that, right? And some of them are not able to do it for a while because they just need to get themselves established and all of those things. And then even once they put the paperwork through, it could take a year, right? So there's folks who know they want to be a nonprofit. There's folks who know they don't want to be a nonprofit. And I'm being specific about that language because sometimes when we say for profit, I don't know, it's a triggering thing for folks that it's well, that's corporate bad media. It's no. It's an independent media model of people who want to have some ownership, and that's okay because it's their thing. They've started it. They're determining which way it goes, and they are independent. And I think a lot of times when we use the word nonprofit, sometimes we should really be saying independent news as opposed to just nonprofit, because it's sort of a default when that's not really what we mean. And so those folks who are not wanting to be a nonprofit, they, there's a lot behind that, right? There's issues around the Black press, for example. The historic Black press has often been not nonprofit. And I think a lot of the folks that we have that are also thinking along those lines are folks of color who are I really do want to own something. There's power in me being able to own something and determine the direction of where it goes, and not having a board determine that for me. And then the third bucket, I think, are folks who are a little bit on the fence because they are not sure yet which way their audience would be able to support them the best. And so they kind of want to just get started and then make that determination a little bit later once they get their feet under them. And so all of those different things that you mentioned, right? So reader support, philanthropy, which can come in a lot of different packages, advertising as well, other things. I mean, one of the things that some of our members are interested in is having a workshop about merch and merchandise, right? Especially in very local places where people really love their community. People love merch. I live in Washington, D.C., and I don't know the number of T-shirts that I've bought for my husband that have the district or DC or 202 or whatever, like that, that kind of stuff, right? And I think there's a real opportunity for a lot of our folks to get into the merch business. And it's become easier over time to do that because you don't have to have all this inventory around you all the time and things like that. So as that kind of the vendor situation there has gotten better, that opens up opportunities for our folks. So I think we're real open to a lot of different ways, and we just want to meet the needs of what we're hearing from folks. And merch is one of the questions that we've had. Advertising is an interesting one too. I mean, again, depending on what world you're in, it's either advertising or sponsorship, right? And trying to think about that. We're actually in the process of putting together a report that's being funded by Hewlett about what the needs are around advertising for really, really, really small publishers, our extra, extra small and extra small folks, and trying to think about that. And we've had some conversations with some folks about how someone would know that they're ready for advertising, right? It's not just how you do it, but it's like, how do you know you're ready for it? Which I think speaks to a bigger issue too for our folks. It's like, if they get some money and they have some money coming in the door, how do they use that money to the best of their ability, right? What's their first hire? Even if it's not a full-time person, like, should I hire a part-time this thing over here or a part-time that thing over there? Like, how do we make those decisions? So again, we're not prescriptive about that, but we do, kind of talk through people through those things and have them think about what that looks like for them.
And do you have a stance on paywalls? Do your members, how many of them have paywalls?
That's a good question. I don't know that we've taken stock of that. That is one of many things I would like to take stock of in some member surveys that we'll do with our new membership director. Off the top of my head, I don't believe that we have folks with a paywall. I think most of them are oriented around having things freely available and instead are asking for members to support them. I'm almost positive that that's true. There's some one-off situations where we have someone who is actually a newspaper publisher, and they're more interested in the community aspect of what we're doing. They live in a place where digital is really not available because of broadband issues, which I know you're very aware of. So I think that's something that we want to sort of monitor over time. But like in that case, like he has subscriptions, but he's also a nonprofit. So it's not really subscriptions, right? So there's like all these like competing interests around that. But for the most part, I don't believe that any of our sites have a paywall. And again, that's not up to me. It's up to whatever they think is going to be best for them. I think the paywall questions are really, it's a conundrum in a lot of ways, because I want to make sure that folks, even if they're not well off or well-heeled, have access to news information about their communities. I know there are some organizations out there that will like bring the paywall down for things that they, will deem sort of public interest. I appreciate that, but I also think there's a lot of other things that that really are public interest that would be great to have access to, and they don't make that decision. So, it's a very nuanced conversation.
Yeah. Well, so you're providing, advice and support that is bespoke, right? And
to some degree, yeah.
That doesn't scale very well. So as an organization, how do you manage that?
Well, that's the phase that we're in right now, Tim. So that's part of why we're bringing on this membership director. We have to start thinking about, like, how can we more efficiently think about what we provide? What are the things that we can do that are one to many? So that then for the things that really do need to be one-on-one, we have the time for that, right? And so that's where some of the questions that you're asking about, categorization and this, that, and the other, all those things, like we need to get better information about like kind of where people are, so that we can start to kind of orient those workshops and those things towards sort of the larger group of people, and then make time when possible for those one-to-one conversations. But, as we grow, I think the other part of this is we need to be looking for patterns. We've started to see some of them. Like the smaller the community, it's harder to see those patterns. But as we grow the community, we'll start to see those patterns more, and then be able to kind of direct services to people in ways that meet their needs, but don't require, a 30-minute phone conversation with every single member, once a week or whatever. That, like, we couldn't even do that now, right? So yeah, so that's something that we're thinking about ourselves, and I'm eager to bring this new person on to help think about that. I think that's also where partnerships come into play with other organizations. One of the things that, I think I said near the top is, like, we picked a lane. We did that on purpose. And I think if we can be pretty disciplined about sticking to that lane, we're going to be better off, which means, we stick to our lane, whatever the saying was. I think it was, I can't remember if it was Jeff Jarvis or Jay Rosen off the top of my head now, but it's sort of like, do what you do best and link to the rest. Like, we are basically need to do that equivalent in the journalism support space. And one of the two of those people is going to be really mad at me that I can't remember which one it was. I think it was Jarvis.
Sounds like Jarvis. So last question before we go to rapid fire. Who is Tiny News Collective really for? Like, if we've got a journalist or even an organization that already exists thinking about whether membership might make sense for them, what are the criteria?
So we are looking for early stage news founders and news entrepreneurs. You don't have to have launched yet. You just have, we want you to have a concept and an idea. We do have an application process, and we don't take everyone. In that application process, we ask about who your intended audience is and what revenue opportunities you think are related to that particular audience or audiences, right? There's a lot of other questions as well around background and sort of orientation and ethics and those sorts of things. But for us, I think it's really important that we are bringing people in who have a very clear idea of who their audience is intended to be, and that they've got some ideas around what their revenue opportunities might also be. So, most of the folks that we're working with are solopreneurs, but we do have a handful of co-founders. I expect to see more co-founders, I will say, because I think that's become a little bit of a trend. It's easier to help each other out. And one of the co-founders situations I think that we're going to be looking at soon has like 4 or 5 people, right? And so they can spread the work out a little bit more, which is great. So yeah, so early stage news founders. And the other thing is we really want to see folks who are serving communities that are underserved. That's a big swath, though, I will say, right? I mean, there's sort of more the obvious kinds of underserved areas, BIPOC folks, LGBTQ folks and communities, rural communities, et cetera. But there's also a lot of places, so I live in Washington, D.C. It's not considered a news desert, but there are lots of places in the city that are not covered at all. And I think people can make the case that, there are lots of places in cities or other places that look like they're being covered, and they're really not. And that also goes for topical sites. So we have both kind of what you would probably more traditionally call like local news, and then we've got other topical sites as well. And we're open to all of that. We're open to all of that as long as people understand who their audience is and, again, those revenue opportunities that go along with that.
All right. So now for rapid fire questions. And the questions are quick, but your answers don't have to be. First question, compared to a year ago, are you more or less optimistic about the future of local news?
Whoa. I'm going to say more.
What gives you that optimism?
I'm trying to be rapid fire, Tim. I get a lot of energy from our members. And, we had our collective call this week, and it's spring. So there's all these things coming together that make me feel like there's more opportunities out there. We just need to figure out how to seize them.
Does AI fill you with more hope or dread when it comes to journalism?
I was in a session last week where I walked out being like, the world's going to end. So right now I will say less optimistic. I see opportunities, but there's a lot of things that scare me about it, not because of journalism, but because of the way that technology has rolled out in the last 20, 30 years. And I just don't know, quite frankly, that our government, for example, is prepared for what that looks like and how to actually not cede all power to the technology companies. So that's my concern.
Messy desk or clean desk?
Depends on where you are. Both. I have both. My husband will say messy, but I will say it's both I have multiple areas where I am. So both.
Do you have a favorite piece of advice that you like to give or that you've been given?
The thing that's coming to mind is something that somebody told me a long time ago. Actually, an ex-boyfriend told me a long time ago, which was I'm not going to say it as eloquently as I'd like to right now, but basically like, don't discount yourself or like, don't take yourself out of the running for a job before the other people do. So don't, I think this speaks to the like imposter syndrome that a lot of folks have and that I also have, which is don't talk yourself out of something before you even have the opportunity potentially put in front of you.
Do you have a favorite failure of yours?
Oh, yes. Actually, I told somebody about this the other day. So when I was applying for college, so my parents really didn't go to college. My dad went to like a couple of years, but like was not, so I was the first in my family to go to college. My sister didn't go. So I kind of did that all on my own. And I applied to maybe like 10 or 11 places. And the one place I didn't get into was Georgetown. So I said earlier, I live in Washington, D.C. Several years ago, one of the jobs I had was as the assistant dean of the Master's in Journalism program at Georgetown. So I was both an instructor and administrator at the school that would not admit me as an undergrad. So I like how that kind of can turn around, and you never know.
Yeah. Do you have a favorite place to think big?
Nature. So my husband and my children and I are trying to make it to as many national parks as we can. I think all of us together, my husband and I have been to a couple more than our children have, but together I think we've been to about 13 or 14. We're going to 3 more later this year in Washington State. And there's nothing like a hike in the woods or in the desert. Like we were in southern Utah for spring break this year, like to clear your mind and give you perspective and, kind of like wash away all of the agita of the world. And so that's where I would go, is nature.
Aside from nature, do you have anything else you like to do to maintain your sanity, or do you have advice you like to give to these overworked and stressed entrepreneurs?
So the thing I do is I get up real early every morning, Monday through Friday at 4:50 to exercise. That's what keeps the demons away for me. Sometimes it's just a long walk. I live about 2 miles from the U.S. Capitol, and I'll take my dog on a long walk. Or sometimes it's a really high impact workout that involves like kickboxing. I don't really like running, but I do it because it's a faster form of getting that kind of exercise in. I think I don't really have advice for people about that, except to say that everyone needs to find their thing that actually gives them peace. And I will say that I've really, really in the last year plus have been doing a lot more meditating and have found that works. But that's one of those things like exercise that if you don't do it consistently, it doesn't actually work. It only works if you're doing it consistently, which sometimes it's hard to do. But it's good to quiet the mind and all of that and wrestle, because that's what I do. I wrestle with the fleeting thoughts all the time. But I think people need to find their own thing. Like I know lots of people who love crafting or, any number of different activities, playing music, etc. So I think people just have to find what works for them.
Do you have a favorite time-saving hack?
Ooh, I'm sure I do. I just don't know what it is off the top of my head. I'm a big to-do list person. I think that saves me time. It definitely saves me like mental energy and mental load. So looking at my notebook right now, I have like pages and pages and pages of to-do lists, which I'm also trying to teach my children to do. My daughter's taken to it a little bit more than my son has, but their grandmother also is a big to-do list person. So my husband's not really. He kind of gets annoyed about the to-do list, but it's because it's his mom who's the to-do list person. So that would probably be my go-to for time management and stuff like that.
And then the penultimate question is typically, what does wild success look like 5 years? But I want to use a phrasing that you actually wrote about, I think, when you started Tiny News.
Ooh, you're going to recruit. You're going to read me back to me? Oh, no.
Yes. You said you stood before about 80 thinkers and doers in the journalism industry and asked them to imagine the best future for local news. So how would you answer that question?
So right now, I would say what I would love to see is the seeding and flowering and flourishing of maybe thousands of news organizations across the country. But I don't think those folks have to go it alone. What I would love to see is that in particular geographic regions, and you could give a definition to that, whether it's a town, a city, a region, or even a state, that actually those organizations, they're independent, but they work with each other. And they're not just working with each other on content. I think it's actually more important that they're networked together on the business side. So going back to the accountants for reporters or accountants for journalists thing, could Wichita, with the 3 sites that we were helping to seed there, could the 3 of those sites work together and find one accountant for all 3 of them? Could they, think about finding a grant writer that would help all 3 of them? There's this really cool movement, I think, going on of workers' collectives that we in journalism need to be learning from. And I think that, to me, would be what I would want to see, because it would mean that these organizations are sustainable, but they're not having to hold the whole load for all of those positions that are needed. They're able to be in community and in collectives with others doing important, impactful work, but having the support that they need. And that, to me, is really what, I struggle, we use the word sustainability all the time, and I think it's important, but it also feels like a fixed place, and it's not. Just like any small business out there could be successful now and then have some down years. Does that mean they're not sustainable? I don't know, right? What does that mean? So I think we need to think about this in a broader way and kind of break past some of the things in the past that we think is the way that media should be. So I think many more smaller organizations, but that they're supported with sort of a back-end structure that serves multiple outlets. That's what I would hope for. And for them, what I would hope for those communities is that they're getting some, damn fine journalism that isn't just doom and gloom, but is also connecting them together as a community.
And then final question, 3 to 5 pieces of media that you would recommend. It could be TV, podcast, books. It doesn't have to be news related.
Okay. I was going to ask about that. So news related, I would say I'm a big fan of CityCast. They're an organization that's got both sort of audio. They've got podcasts and newsletters in a number of cities across the U.S. They do have one here in D.C., and I love it, and I listen to it almost every morning. And I'm a paid member, so that's how much I love them. What else? I listen to a lot of comedy podcasts because I need more joy in my life. So I listen to Mike Birbiglia's Working It Out, which is a podcast in which Mike Birbiglia, who's a comedian and storyteller, interviews other comedians. And I find that fascinating. There's a whole section of his podcast, which is where the name comes from, that is about working jokes out. So they will actually talk about their jokes with other comedians and riff on each other and give each other help, which I think is really fascinating. I love hearing how jokes come together and what works and what doesn't. I do listen to Mark Maron's WTF podcast. I haven't been listening as religiously, although I was very excited to hear him interview Carol Burnett. That was a person I'd really wanted him to interview. She's amazing. She's 90 years old, and she's I just love her, and just in so many ways. Things I'm reading. I feel like I read more books than I do. Well, I mean, I graze like everybody else does, right? But the book I'm reading right now is called The Checklist Manifesto. And it's really interesting to think about how checklists can be, we were talking about time savers, right? How checklists could be a tool that we could use in journalism to make things easier. I think about this a lot with our members, like what are templatized things that they can do that won't look inauthentic, but will be pieces of content and pieces of, stories and things like that that will still serve their communities. So I think that's like kind of in the checklist kind of area. I'm trying to think about what else I'm reading right now. I mean, there's a local blog here that I like, which is The Hill is Home. So I live sort of near Capitol Hill. I'm not technically on it, but we're right next door. So I read The Hill is Home to kind of find out what's going on in my general neighborhood. There's also a good newsletter called the DC Line that comes out pretty much every day, like Monday through Friday, talking about all the news going on in DC, just so that I'm kind of plugged in to what's happening around the city. Those are some of the things. I also listen, I'm in the process of, this is more entertainment. I'm in the process of re-watching, although I never watched all of it, Northern Exposure, which is now on Amazon for anyone who wants to do that. And there is a companion episode by episode podcast called Northern Overexposure that I listen to, that these like two guys who are doing the same thing I'm doing. It's a little bit dated because they were doing it sort of during the pandemic, but it still applies because they're talking about all these episodes. So that's the like guilty pleasure thing that I'm like do.
Have you watched Hacks?
I have. Actually, I know there's a new season, and I started watching that last week. Again, I watch a lot of comedy, so like I can't figure out whether I like John Mulaney's Everybody's in LA yet. Like I like pieces of it. I don't like the whole show yet, but he did a really great interview, or other way around. David Letterman did a really great interview with John Mulaney in his new, or not new anymore, but like his show on Netflix. So again, I spent a lot of time with comedy. I saw Mark Maron last week, actually, in DC, and 2 weeks ago I saw Trevor Noah with my 12-year-old son. And I will see Mike Birbiglia later in June when he comes here. So yeah, I'm it's my year of comedy, actually. I've been trying to go to more shows and having a little bit more fun injected into my life and not being so serious all the time.
All right. Well, thank you for your time. This has been great.
Thanks. Take care.
Thank you for listening to the Local News Matters podcast. Never miss an episode by subscribing in your favorite podcast player and sign up for our newsletter at lnmpod.com. And thanks to our production partners at Pirate Audio. Pirate Audio believes every community deserves great things to listen to, and they're on a mission to help local newsrooms reach their communities via audio. If you're interested in starting a podcast or need production support for an existing one, let me know and I'll be happy to connect you. If you have guest recommendations, others doing interesting and innovative work in local news, let me know through the contact form at the website lnmpod.com.